Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's The Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where we shall be taking a look at the important articles which have appeared in today's newspaper, that is for 12th of October 2023. And we shall be analyzing those articles in slightly greater detail, trying to understand what can be the various different aspects from which questions can be asked from those particular articles. So without further ado, let us take a look at the articles that we are going to hold a discussion for. So in total, we are going to have a discussion for 5 different articles and 5 different topics today. Out of those, 3 are going to be a bit detailed, where we are going to have a detailed analysis from your mains perspective in general. So here, by the way, for each of these articles, we shall also try to have some of the conclusions which can be required for your prelims preparation as well. So the first article, that is UN Security Council Reform is a Song in a Loop. Now, this has appeared in page 8. Now, that is the editorial section. This is relevant for your GS paper 2. Now, this article talks about the requirement of a reform in UN Security Council and why for a long period of time that aspect or that clamor call for reform has been falling on deaf ears and why there has not been a significant amount of movement in that regard. So that is something that we are going to analyze. While analyzing this article itself, we are basically also going to try to understand what is the concept of the G4 nations, what is the concept of the coffee consensus or the coffee club nations, so which can be relevant for your prelims perspective. Then another article which has appeared in the next page, that is Women's Quota, Rhetoric or Reality. This has got to do with the aspect of Women's Reservation Bill, and the very important part of it that the Women's Reservation is linked to the next delimitation exercise which is scheduled to happen in 2026. So this article talks about whether that linking was required or not. So this is again going to be relevant for your GS paper 2. Here, briefly, we are also going to discuss with the help of this article, and by touching on this topic, we are going to discuss slightly in greater detail about the aspect of delimitation as well. A brief history of delimitation as has been carried out in India as well. Again, something which will be useful for your prelims. Then concerns about government's fact-check unit. This is about the recent observations made by the Bombay High Court regarding certain PILs which were filed regarding the new IT rules that had been framed by the union government and the relevance of the fact-checking unit being or what the government was actually envisaging to set up. So this has appeared in page 10, relevant for your GS paper 3. Now, a couple of articles that we are going to discuss for your prelims perspective itself, and that is Operation Ajay, which has been launched recently by India in order to evacuate its citizens, and Indian Ocean Rim Association, which has appeared in page 12. So that is something that we are going to discuss as we move along. I would request and urge all of you that at the end of the discussion, kindly do visit the YouTube or the Telegram channel. The link is provided in the description below, and there you can take up the quiz for the multiple choice questions which have been framed from the topic and all the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today, and thereby you can analyze your level of understanding for the articles and the relevant news points from today's newspaper. So let us take a look at the first article straight away, and this is an article appearing in the editorial section, and this deals with your international relations, and that is for your GS2. Now here, this article talks about the requirement of the UN Security Council reform, something that India has been advocating for a long period of time now. And you have to understand that it is not only India which has been raising a clamor call for the reform in the UN Security Council. Also, like-minded nations such as Germany, Brazil, Japan, all of them have been following the same suit and the same idea. But for a long period of time, despite the fact that various different member nations also in a private manner and on a bilateral basis, and also when it comes to the altars of the United Nations, many of the statements made by the UN security or the basic UN head, all of them, they accrue to the same fact that, look, the reform is the need of the hour. And even recently, when we talk about the UN Secretary General, UN Secretary General also made the statement that unless and until we reform the United Nations Security Council, it is slowly and steadily becoming obsolete, and it is something that the nations won't respect anymore. Recently, you also had the Turkish president also making a statement that the United Nations of today, they do not represent the realities of today's world, and hence there is an urgent requirement for the reform in the United Nations. So that is something about which the article tells or sets a pretext about. Now here, before we move ahead, just to give you a brief idea about the present structure of the United Nations Security Council. So that United Nations Security Council has got 5 permanent members. Those 5 permanent members, they have the veto power, right? So that is what differentiates them. So those 5 permanent members, which are they? So basically, you have China, France, Russia, UK and US. These are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. But also, other than that, it has got around 10 non-permanent members, which have got around 2-year terms. Now, there the membership is basically divided amongst the various different regions of the globe. So you need to have 3 members from Africa, 2 members from Asia, 2 members from Latin America, 2 members from Western Europe and the other region nearby, and 1 member from the Eastern Europe. So this is the general formation that you observe of the UN Security Council. Generally, countries such as India, we find our way in this particular portion of non-permanent members, and that is where we sometimes get an opportunity to get ourselves represented at the UN Security Council. But then, the aspect or the argument here is simple, that the United Nations of today, they still represent the geopolitical realities of 1940s and 1945, because United Nations was set immediately after the Second World War, and it significantly reflects the Second World War or World War II realities out there. So that is why, in order to prevent it from becoming obsolete, there is a requirement of a reform. Now, just to give you some stats as indicated by the article here, that when the United Nations was founded in 1945, the Security Council at that point of time had 11 members. Out of the total 55 members who were part of UN, 11 members were present or had their representation at the UN Security Council, which basically came out to be around 22% representation, right? Out of all the total member nations, there was a 22% representation in the UN Security Council. Now look at the situation today. There has been a change in the UN Charter, which was made basically in 1965. And that was the only time when the original UN Charter was amended in such a manner, where the requirement of the total membership of the Security Council, that was expanded from 11 to 15. That means the 10 non-permanent members, the structure that we have today, that change was brought about in 1965. But then still the situation has not changed significantly, because if you take a look at it today, now out of 193 members, the Council has got 15 members, meaning around 8% representation only. That is, today, UNGA, UN General Assembly, has got 193 member countries. Out of all those 193 member countries, only 15 of them, they find their way into the UN Security Council. So that is a gross misrepresentation or underrepresentation, to be very precise. And that does not and cannot under any circumstance represent the present realities and the interests of the world order. So that is why there is an urgent need for reform, and countries like India have been vociferously voicing that issue for a long period of time. Now, UN basically still represents the realities of 1945. It does not take into account the contribution which have been made by countries such as India, Germany, Japan, etc. in the recent past, in the recent decades, in order to shape the present world order. For example, when you take the case of India, by our sheer humanitarian operations that we carry out across the globe, be it the number of troops that India supplies for the UN peacekeeping missions, by all these measures, India has ensured a lasting and sustained peace in many parts of the world, and also has ensured that humanity is the one which needs to be respected. Having said that, India is the largest country in the world in terms of its absolute population. And in the coming decades, it is going to further cement that position with having a burgeoning youthful population as well. Now, it does not make any sense at all for that particular country, a country of that stature like India, not to have its say at the highest decision making of the globe. Because 1945 realities don't hold true today. Today's India is nowhere close to what it was in 1945. So that is why UN needs to basically take cognizance of these new changing geopolitical landscape. Also, other examples if you take. For example, take the case of countries such as Germany and Japan. Now, Germany and Japan, through certain past amount of history, if you consider their contribution in United Nations, the amount of funding that they have provided to United Nations has been substantially greater than all the other different permanent members of the UN Security Council other than US. Take US as an exception. Other than that, the remaining 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council, their contribution in terms of monetary fund to the UN, that has been outdone basically by Germany and Japan. But the UN Charter still lists Germany and Japan as enemy states. What does that tell you? It tells you the mindset. It tells you that it still basically relies on the same mindset that the victors of the Second World War. They framed the New World Order. And that New World Order basically still represents those realities. That is something which is paradoxical. Because the world has already witnessed this happen before. It is something which is happening or repeating again, in the sense that even after the First World War, you had the victors forming the League of Nations. At a point of time when the League of Nations was thought to be not representing enough ideas and enough voices across the world, it became obsolete and Second World War could not be prevented. That was the major task or the basic challenge of the League of Nations. Now look at the condition of United Nations today. If United Nations wants to basically pass any of the resolution condemning any kind of aggressive moves by any of the countries, immediately it is vetoed by some interest or the other. For example, even if it takes up very urgent issues such as naming or designating an individual as a terrorist, you have countries such as China immediately blocking that, immediately vetoing that. Why? To score a larger geopolitical advantage goal, to indicate and actually send out a signal, send out a message about their might. Right. Now, also, if you think about the situation, for example, the Russian aggression in Ukraine and the Russian troops moving into Ukraine. Now, UN Security Council could not do anything about that. Before that, even if you take a look at the past couple of decades or more, then the US invasion in Iraq, US invasion in Syria, US invasion in the various different other Middle Eastern nations, Afghanistan. Now, none of them basically could be prevented by the United Nations. Even recently, as recent as the last few days, you have a kind of a significant amount of aggression and attack and counterattack going on between Israel on one side and a host of other regional players on the other side. Now again, what is the purpose of United Nations if all these violent activities, all these aggressive activities are still continuing to happen? So that tells you that the UN Security Council has largely become an ornamental body now. It does not have enough teeth to prevent the powerful countries from taking the action that they want. Right? If it could come to a country such as India, for example, if India were to take some action, all the various different permanent members, they would swoop down on countries such as India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, and they would not allow these countries to take any of these aggressive action, even for self-defense. But when it comes to their own interest, there is a significant amount of disparity about how UN is treated by these nations, or what is the importance or prominence of UN in the eyes of the policymaking by these nations. So that tells you that there is a need for an urgent reform. And here, it does not represent the population at all. Because think about it, of all the various different nations which are present in South America, that is the region of the Latin America, the region of Africa, the entirety of the population of Asia, you have one representative. right? And if you think about it, Europe having only around 5% of the global population, and as per certain calculations and estimations, even lesser than 5% of the global population lives in Europe, but Europe has got a significant more than 33% representation in the various different governing organs and governing bodies of United Nations. So it tells you that the UN of today still is archaic in terms of its structure, in terms of its outlook, in terms of its behavior about the UN almost of the past century. So how can we expect the other nations to respect the Charter of United Nations, to respect any observation made by the UN Secretary General, any of these, because that will immediately be flouted, because now the countries have got a set template. Russia can block a particular resolution against North Korea. Russia can block a certain resolution against maybe China, against predatory economics. US will block certain resolutions. So it has come to a kind of a deadlock where the very validity and the existence of this is put to question. Now here, there have been various different countries who have been advocating for reform. And in fact, in this article, Shashi Tharoor, basically, who is the author of this article, he has argued that even when he worked in United Nations almost more than 20 years back, even at that point of time, the talk of the town was that there is a need to urgently reform the United Nations. But that is something that has eluded the realities. Now, there are 4 such nations who have formed a grouping somewhere around the time of 2005, and these 4 nations, that is basically Brazil, Germany, India and Japan, they have basically formed a grouping that is G4 in order to promote Security Council reform created in the time of 2004-2005. Now, it calls for the enlargement of both permanent as well as non-permanent categories. It talks about the enlargement to 25 members in total by adding 6 permanent members and 4 non-permanent members. So the structure that these countries are advocating is basically, overall you should have, in a way, 11 permanent members and as well as we can have 14 non-permanent members. The argument is that this will be reflective of the new realities, okay? And this will be able to accommodate various different voices from almost all the continents of the world. It does not make sense for the most populous continent of the world to have only one representative, that is China, which is hardly a beacon of hope or hardly an example for what should be the governance order or what should be the respect of international order and international rule of law. Think about it, that Asia's representative to the UN Security Council permanent seat is China, for that matter. So you can think about the respect of the global law and the global norms of order that the other countries will follow. Now, sensing a kind of a resistance from the other nations of the UN, these G4 nations, basically, they have agreed that if they are made a part of those permanent seats of the UN Security Council, they are ready to forego their veto power for at least 15 years. So already they are trying to create a kind of a compromise situation so that it can lead to the revalidation of the UN Security Council. And this is, by the way, relevant for your prelims, that what do we understand by G4? Okay. Now here, the difference is, or the issue is, that this reform exercise in itself is not very easy. And despite the fact that whenever you see the US president coming to India, whenever you see Russian president earlier when he used to come to India, or any of these dignitaries, when they come, they always support India's cause for being a member of the UN Security Council. And that is something that they do on the face. But basically, even those 5 permanent members, they are a bit reluctant in order to lead to the expansion of the UN Security Council, because that will basically mean that their own special advantage, because this is the highest decision-making body of the world in a way. So that advantage that they have, that will be diluted, and nobody likes that. So there is a bit of reluctance on the part of the permanent members as well. But a greater opposition comes up from the other nations in the region. For example, for India's membership, you have a significant amount of resistance and lobbying done by countries such as Pakistan. And Pakistan has been an important player in forming the Coffee Club or the United for Consensus group of countries, which talk about the requirement that why the UN Security Council should be kept as it is, why the seat should not be enlarged. Why? Because of historical rivalries, because of the fact that they won't be comfortable if India also becomes a part of the UN Security Council. And you have other countries such as China who also won't like to see another country in their own neighborhood becoming a part of the Security Council when presently they can claim a kind of a hegemony in that. Now, let's suppose that we make these oppositions go away. Still, the aspect of amending the charter is very complicated. First of all, the amendment requires an overwhelming two-third majority. That means close to around 129 out of the 193 nation states which are present, which are a part of UN, they need to agree to the aspects of these expansion. Not only that, there is a requirement for ratification as well. That is, if you want to amend the UN Charter, you need to get it ratified by two-thirds countries as well. And when we say ratification, that means all these countries who have agreed to the changes, they need to get it ratified by their parliaments. Think about it, and that is what this article argues, that it is no longer sufficient to convince these member countries to agree to the expansion of the Security Council. Now, you will have to convince the legislators of each of these member nations as well to allow for the expansion. Now, that is simply an impossible task. Any individual legislator, any individual political party in any of these nations means they can hold a roadblock for the expansion of the UN Security Council. This is the reason why the problem has festered and persisted for so long, despite so many voices coming out in unison about the requirement of the expansion. Okay, so that is basically why it is not being done. Now, here, another aspect relevant for your prelims, that is Coffee Club or Uniting for Consensus. So this basically comprises 48 member states that have been instrumental in holding back the reforms. Now, these are largely the middle-sized states who oppose their bigger neighbors from becoming a part of the UN Security Council. And various different countries have reservations against their neighbors. For example, Brazil becoming a part of the UN Security Council is opposed by countries such as Argentina as well as countries such as Mexico, saying that they do not exactly represent the Hispanic diversity present in the region. Similarly, Germany's membership is opposed by the countries such as Italy and Spain. Japan's membership is opposed by countries such as South Korea and significantly China as well. China doesn't want Japan to become a member. And also, Japan's membership is opposed by Australia as well. Similarly, India's membership is opposed by Pakistan and China as well. So all these various different countries, the mid-sized countries, they have formed the Coffee Club or the United for Consensus. So the prime movers of the club, Italy, Spain, Australia, Canada, South Korea, Argentina, and Pakistan. Now, here you might have a question that prosperous nations such as Canada, for example, what does Canada have to do with India becoming a part of the UN Security Council or Brazil becoming a part of the UN Security Council? What does South Korea have to do? Why does it oppose that? So basically, they oppose the larger principle of any change in the governance structure. And secondly, it does not behave well for countries such as Canada, South Korea, etc., which are good on or doing well in terms of the economic prospect, in terms of the per capita income. They are much more prosperous than countries such as India, Brazil. Now, they would not like to see poorer nations getting a participation in that highest table. So that is why they form an opposition. There are other changes or the other issues due to which reform is not happening as well. For example, Africa. Africa is a continent which is not represented at the United Nations Security Council in the form of the permanent seat. So despite the fact that various different countries are agreeing to the fact that you need one particular member nation from Africa, the African countries are divided over it. Whether Nigeria should be made a part of it, whether South Africa should be made a part of it, whether you make Egypt a part of it, and on what basis are you going to decide which country of Africa is going to be a part of the UN Security Council. So because of all these issues, the reform is getting delayed. The reform is getting delayed endlessly for decades now. And because of that delay in reform, United Nations Security Council is becoming a kind of a ornamental body of at best, without significant usage at the ground reality, without having any significant influence to change any kind of aggressive posturing made by certain member nations, and thereby UN Security Council is failing to ensure or enforce an international rule based upon law and order. So that is the learning from this article, that we need that reform. What are the problems for that reform, and why is it that the problems, they keep on coming back? And a part of that problem is the requirement which is needed to get any amendment in process. Okay, now coming to the second article of the day, and that is women's quota, rhetoric and reality. So yesterday also we have had a detailed discussion about the fact that why the women's reservation bill is the way to go and why it is required to bring about a greater equity in the society. Now this article also deals with that in a similar perspective. This is basically again relevant for your GS paper 2. But here there's a larger issue which is addressed in this article. This article talks about the fact that, look, when you talk about the Women's Reservation Bill, agreed that it is a noble gesture. It is something whose time had come. It is something which is required for the general upliftment of the society. Agreed. But then, one of the important clauses to that bill is that it is linked to the delimitation exercise to be carried out in 2026. And that is where this article argues that by linking it to delimitation exercise, you are basically postponing a kind of a promise, you are pushing people into a kind of a fairyland, and where the reality or this women reservation bill becoming a reality can be a distant dream altogether. So it starts by highlighting the requirement, the necessity of providing a kind of a women reservation. And it highlights or makes its points by indicating the fact that the representation, the political representation by women is abysmally low. For example, in the Lok Sabha, you have only 82 MPs who are women, and that represents only 15% of the total elected people or the members in the Lok Sabha, and that is significantly low. But then think about Rajya Sabha, where you only have 31 women MPs representing only 12% of the elected or the people present, the MPs present in Rajya Sabha. Even yesterday also we talked about the gender gap index. Now there also India's performance is very bad. India's ranking is around 141 out of the 182 various different nations who have participated in this exercise. So we require that women reservation to come into place, and we have had ample discussion for that. So what is the problem? The problem is it being linked with the process of delimitation. So here very briefly, we will cover the aspect of delimitation again for your prelims. Relevant for your prelims, and even for mains examination this can be relevant. So what is it? So delimitation basically is resetting of the constitutional boundaries, not the constitutional in the sense, but the boundaries of the individual constituencies. The constituencies which will vote to elect the MLAs or the MPs. So that boundary of the constituency, that is reset, that is supposed to be reset after every census. That was the basic idea behind delimitation. Why? So as to ensure that it represents the present population structure of any particular region, because Article 82, and if you take a look at Article 81 and 82, so the Article 81 basically says that the ratio between the number of seats and the population of the state is, so far as practicable, the same for all states. That is, the number of people representing or electing one particular leader or any elected representative, what is the population that they are catering to, that ratio should remain almost similar. so as to ensure that proper uniform care is paid for welfare activities across the length and breadth of the country. Now, Article 82 basically says that after every census is completed, census is basically an exercise which is carried out every 10 years. That is, the last census was carried out in 2011, before that 2001, before that 1991. Now, this time, after 2011, the census exercise has been delayed, initially because of the COVID pandemic, but now it is supposed to happen somewhere around after the next general election, somewhere around 2025 or 2026 is when the census exercise is slated to be held. So, Article 82 of the Indian Constitution says that after every census, you should rearrange the constituency boundaries in order to ensure that the ratio of the seats and the population largely remains the same. So that it should not be the case that one elected representative in one constituency has got 1 lakh voters, and in one constituency, one elected representative has 1 crore voters. So obviously, the attention paid will be difficult. So that is why periodic delimitation should be carried out as per the Constitution. Now, what is the process of that? So, Election Commission basically, it demarcates or defines the exercise as the process of drawing boundaries of constituencies for elected bodies based upon the population as declared by census. An independent delimitation commission is set up, right, once every decade for the reapportion of these seats. Now, if you take a look at the history of it, now delimitation has been carried out 4 times, 1952, then 1963, 1973, and then after that in 2002. However, the number of seats in the Lok Sabha, according to the rise in population, has been changed only thrice. That is in 1952, where the total number of seats in Lok Sabha were taken up to be 500. It is a different matter altogether that out of those 500, hardly around 489 seats were contested. And then in 1963, owing to the new realities of population as carried out by the census exercise. Remember, this was the era of population expansion in India. This was the era when the death rate started falling low and the birth rates were still high. So the population started increasing quite significantly. So there was an adjustment which was done on the basis of the total number of seats that is allocated to each of the states as well, right? And the total number of seats in Lok Sabha, that was altered to 522. Then again in 1973, that limit was taken to 545. But then, at the time, significantly during the 42nd Amendment in 1976, right, the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, it froze the aspect of delimitation altogether. The argument was that, look, we are trying to bring about family planning. Remember, 1970s, during the time of 1975-76, that is during the time of the emergency. That was the time when India was significantly following the aspect of family planning, ensuring that the population should not increase. And that is where you had various different types of measures carried out by the government in order to ensure that one does not have more kids. So at that point of time, the government of India made a decision that we will freeze the number of seats up till around 2001. And the argument was that in a way, if we keep on increasing the seats, it will always be rewarding those populous nations or populous states of the country, and it will be disincentivizing for those particular states who have managed to keep a control on their population. So that is why that activity was frozen for the next 25 years until the 2001 census under Article 82. Now, in 2002, delimitation was again put off for the next 25 years with the 84th Amendment. Now, this was done even though in 2002, the delimitation which was carried out, the boundaries of the constituency, they were altered, right? But the total number of seats, they were not tampered with, they were not tinkered with the prime aspect that again, they would be formulating the same aspect of ensuring that after the census which is carried out beyond 2026, that will be used for the future delimitation. So the amendment froze the allocation of seats in Article 82 until the relevant figures for the first census taken after the year 2026 have been published. And the argument had always been that we are going to basically ensure that population expansion or explosion is brought under control. Because unless and until we do that, we will keep on adding the seats endlessly. And that cannot be an exercise which will be very rewarding going ahead into the future. Because then people will always have the demand that near my area also population is increasing, have a separate constituency. So it will not lead to anything productive. So that is why it was paused. So this is the brief background of it. Now, if you want to carry out the delimitation, here, first of all, the commission, delimitation commission which is set, is appointed by the President of India. That is important. Comprises a retired judge of the Supreme Court or a High Court, the Chief Election Commissioner and the State Election Commissioner. Based upon the data which is released by the census, the commission, in consultation with the state election commissions, examines the changes which have happened in the population in that area. It then publishes the detailed exercise in the Gazette, right, its draft report, and that is open for public feedback. Once the public feedback is taken, once the public feedback is incorporated if required, then after that the commission publishes its final report. And here what is important is that once the final report has been published by the Delimitation Commission, now here as per the Delimitation Commission Act 1952 and Article 329A of the Constitution, they have the full force of law and shall not be called into question in any court. So that is basically the entire process which is to be followed again in 2026. Now the argument which is posed by the article is very simple, that this delimitation exercise is going to be carried out after a long period of time. In that long period of time, you have seen various different states which have emerged as success stories. For example, states such as Kerala, states such as Tamil Nadu. Now, all these states, they basically have managed to bring their own population under control and also ensured that their socio-economic parameters have improved. Now, they have also ensured that they are doing good on the parameters of health, economy, agriculture, all these areas. Meanwhile, you also have certain states such as Uttar Pradesh, such as Bihar, such as even some portions of Odisha, where still, even today, the fertility rate is more than 3 on an average, which tells you that on an average, an individual mother will have 3 kids, right? So think about it. So that means in those particular states which are considered to be economically laggard states, which perform very poorly when it comes to social indicators, health indicators, economic parameters, and their population has been increasing. The argument is that as per the new delimitation exercise, if it is carried out in 2026, these states, that is Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Odisha, etc., where the population has exploded quite significantly, they will be rewarded with more representation in the parliament, with more representation in the legislations, and whereas the other states which are doing good, their proportion of representation in the parliament is going to come down. So various different authors, various different articles have pointed to the fact that it can lead to a kind of a north-south divide whenever that new delimitation exercise is carried out. So it can be a very contentious issue to talk about in brief. And if the enactment of the Women's Reservation Bill is also linked to that delimitation exercise, then it can be something a tall ask, in the sense that you never know when that will be fructified, when will that become a reality. So delimitation is expected to be a very, very contentious issue, to say the least, right? It can foster a north-south divide going ahead into the future, as argued by the article. And reservation has already been provided earlier in government forms in the governance structure in the local bodies as per the 73rd and the 74th Amendment. So the article basically talks about the fact that if already we could do it as per in the local bodies, in the panchayats, etc., depending upon the older census, why could we not have done this or enacted the reservation bill based upon the previous census that is available to us? And that is a question, that is a larger question that it poses in front of the government, in front of the policymakers as well. Now here, oftentimes the argument that you will hear is that the need for having that 2026 delimitation exercise as a T clause was that many of the political parties basically were not comfortable with the women's reservation bill being passed and being implemented today. Because as per many of the political parties, it would have hampered their chances in 2024 elections. Now, that is why this particular contentious clause has been kept. But then it hardly holds any water. It hardly basically stands any argument or counter argument in the sense that whenever you want to implement it, even if you implement it in 2026, it will have certain ramifications and repercussions going ahead for the next elections. So rather than looking at only electoral cycle, the need of the hour is that the policymakers should look at the objective of providing women reservation. If that women's reservation is going to be purely ornamental, as we have seen in the case of the representation and the reservation provided in the local bodies, where you have women members who are made the head of a panchayat or a particular local body, but it is their husbands who hold or wield all the power. So if that ornamental purpose is being sought at, then basically there is no use of providing reservation at all. But if any aspect of providing that reservation is to uplift the women folk of the country, uplift the social strata, then that should be, or providing reservation should be carried out in urgency without waiting for these contentious issues to pan out. So that is what this article basically argues about. Now coming to the third important article, it talks about concerns about the government's fact check unit. Now, the government, as per the new IT rules, whereby it amended the older IT rules of, that is the IT rules 2021, the new IT rules basically talk about setting up of an individual fact-checking unit so that it can stop the spread of fake news, right? Certain kind of news articles or information which can be fake, which can be misleading, which can cause some public harm, damage to the sentiments, etc. So that fact check unit is being set up or is being envisaged to be set up by the government. But then immediately as these rules were passed, you had certain people, you had certain sections, you had a very renowned comedian turned activist, you had basically the Editors Guild of India, you had the Magazine Association, all of them, they basically lodged a PIL in front of the Bombay High Court, and Bombay High Court has come up with certain observations. So that is something that we are going to focus here. So, the context of it. So, the Union government basically promulgated certain amendments to the IT Rules 2021 in April itself, including the provision for a fact-checking unit. This is your fact-check unit. Okay. To flag fake, false and misleading online content related to the government. Now, the rule requires intermediaries to exercise due diligence once the FCU identifies content which can be untrue, or they can lose safe harbor protection as provided under Section 79 of the IT Act from liability of facing any prosecution in certain cases over what third parties post on their platform. In the sense, if we simplify this entire aspect, let's suppose you consider any social media platform like X or any of these social media platform, Facebook, etc. Now, if any of the content is flagged by the FCU, which will be set by the government, now these social media platforms are bound to take that down. If they don't take that down immediately, if it is flagged by the FCU, so think about a social media platform like X, right? It has got certain content, certain amount of content that maybe one of you have posted there. Now, the fact-checking unit set up by the government, it has basically flagged this, that this is basically misleading or untrue. Okay. Now, in this case, the job of X, previously Twitter, is to immediately bring down or take down this contentious material which has been posted there. If it does not do that, then there can be litigations if filed against the social media platform for maybe harming public sentiments, etc. Then the social media platforms, etc., and all these various different third parties, they will be liable. And they won't be provided any safe harbor as per the section 79 of the IT rules. So that means it can very immediately and significantly turn into a litigious case. So that can be problematic for the social media platform. Now the argument which is posed is very simple, that in this way or in this manner, the government can bring down any government of the day. It is a different government today, it might be a different government tomorrow, it might be a third government day after tomorrow. So any government of the day, they can use this arbitrary mechanism in order to bring down any amount of information, any type of information which they think is not representing their own ideas. Right? Now the purpose behind this, the main objective behind setting of the FCU is very simple. It can be considered noble as well, in the sense that fake news, that forms the part of the larger narrative that we see setting around ourselves. Fake news has got the potential to not only instigate various different social riots that we see spanning across various parts of the world, it can give rise to misunderstandings amongst different sections of the society, it can give rise to spread of rumors, and also disturbance of general peace and harmony, right? And fake news in India, we have experienced in the recent past, they have been basically the main cause which has triggered and caused a fire in the society. So that fake news need to be curbed, and for that you do have this FCU. So that is the objective as cited by the government. The ministers of the government have been reiterating the fact that we will ensure that it is credible, it is not biased, etc., etc. But then that also tells you that once this FCU is set up, then there needs to be a check and balance, otherwise it can be a pure depiction of arbitrary power. So because of this, you had activists and Editors Guild of India and the Association of Indian Magazines, they filed writ petitions before the Bombay High Court. And basically, changes in the rule of the IT law deal with the intermediaries in terms of the obligation of the intermediaries such as the social media platform to bring down these articles. Now, the Bombay High Court has reserved its verdict. It is going to issue that verdict very soon, but it made certain very stark observations. It said that no matter how noble your cause is, no matter how noble your objective is, unless and until you prevent or you ensure any kind of checks and balances, then it can be vitiated, right? So the amendments, they lack safeguards. There are no safeguards in the sense that even genuine criticism, if you carry out for the government, it can happen that you can carry out genuine criticism for any policy of the government. Now the government or the FCU can think about or that to be misleading. They can think that to be untrue, that no, we are good, what they are saying is bad, so that can be brought down. So in a way, even constructive criticism, if it is carried out, can be brought down by the FCU. Earlier, you had the Press Information Bureau or PIB, which used to carry that fact-checking exercise. And PIB still does that for a significant bit. In fact, the initial IT rules talked about the importance of PIB in ensuring the veracity of the various facts. So the Bombay High Court has asked the government that basically, why is it that you need to set up the FCU when PIB could do the job? Also, no protection in provision for fair criticism of the government. And Bombay High Court basically has asked that, look, what do you consider as misleading? What can be misleading for you can be the truth for me. So misleading in itself can be very subjective. Think about it. Suppose if you are preparing for the examination and I feel that you are not giving enough amount of time, but from your own end, you are basically putting nights and days together, not having any sleep, etc. So if I write it down that that person is not serious, for me that is the truth, but for you that can be misleading. So if you can ignore or if you can bring down certain content material, certain aspects just based on the principle that they are misleading, then where does it end? So that is what Bombay High Court has basically made the observation about, which is a stark reminder of ensuring constitutional checks and balances to ensure parity in any kind of new legislation which is passed. Once the verdict is issued, we will take a further greater analysis in the IT rules to understand that how the new IT rules can bring about certain change, if at all. Now, after that, we take a look at certain articles relevant for your prelims. So here, basically, Operation Ajay has been launched by India, and Ministry of External Affairs announced this, where this Operation Ajay is basically aimed at bringing individuals from the war-struck region of Israel. So all the individuals who are interested to come back, so there you have various different activities, various different routes which are being thought about, which are being finalized. Commercial carriers, etc. are being roped in order to bring as many citizens as possible. Now, this follows very closely based upon the previous evacuations that the Ministry of External Affairs has ensured. You had Operation Ganga, right? Similarly, you had Operation Kaveri. So, when we talk about the various different other kinds of operation, for example, you had Operation Kaveri, where to rescue people in the war-struck region of Sudan. That was carried out earlier this year in the month of April. May. Operation Ganga was carried out last year to bring people from the war-struck region of Ukraine. And then you have Operation Ajay to bring people from Israel. Right? So, match the following kind of a question can easily be framed from this particular area as well. Now, taking a look at another important article, in the sense that you had a kind of a conclave in Colombo for Indian Ocean Rim Association nations. So basically, IORA, at that conclave, at that meeting, the External Affairs Minister, Minister Jaishankar, basically passed very important statements, in the sense he talked about still the dangers of predatory economics followed by countries such as China. This comes at the light when China is planning to host a meeting for the Belt and Road Initiative, where active participation will be sought, and you will have in attendance presidents of Russia, that is Vladimir Putin, president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo. All of them basically will mark their attendance. President of Sri Lanka, all of them are expected to attend that BRI meeting, the conclave, which will be addressed by Xi Jinping in China. Now, India will not take a part of it, and it is in that aspect that India is making this statement. Now, here we are going to take a look into IORA. What do we mean by IORA? So that is something which is relevant for your examination for prelims. So Indian Ocean Rim Association was formed in March 1997. It has got 23 member states currently, with France being the latest entrant, and the idea was formed by India and South Africa. It is also called the Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation, right? It is the regional tripartite forum. That tripartite means that the government representatives, academia, and business leaders, all of these from the member nations, they are a part of it. And their basic association is founded on the values of regionalism, open regionalism, having trade, having an economic setup which can benefit each one of them, trade facilitation, investment, social development, etc. Now, these are the member nations that you will find. So, the member countries of the IORA and the dialogue partners which have been inducted or which have been instrumental in carrying forward this particular association. Now, another important aspect relevant for your prelims, that is Indian Ocean Dialogue, IOD, is a flagship initiative of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, origins at the 13th Council of Minister meeting in 2013 in Australia. Okay, so that is something which is going to be relevant for your prelims. Now, let us take a look at the questions, the subjective questions which can be framed from these today's topics. So, discuss upon the need for bringing reforms in the UN Security Council structure and elaborate upon the impediments in the way. So, this is for the portion of IR. This is from the portion of GS paper 2. Now here, if you talk about this particular aspect, how do you write the answer? This is a 250 worded answer which is required to be written. In the intro itself, talk about the structure of the Security Council. The structure, how it has basically been a gross underrepresentation of the countries. Talk about the fact that out of 193 member nations, only 15 member nations are a part of it. So that intro, talk about the structure of Security Council. Okay. Then talk about that you have 5 permanent members, then 10 non-permanent members, being taken from each of the individual regions of the globe. Then in the body portion, you have to talk about necessarily the need for reform. That it represents older geopolitical realities, doesn't represent the newer population, voice of the global south. All these matters you can represent here. And then talk about the various impediments. So here you can basically argue about the coffee club nations as well, how nations such as Indonesia, they are a bit reluctant. Pakistan, they are reluctant for India becoming a member of the Security Council, etc. Eventually, while you are concluding the answer, at the time of writing the conclusion, you have to necessarily talk about why reform is the urgent need of the hour in order to ensure relevance of the UN is maintained in the changing and the fast changing global geopolitical landscape. Otherwise, we might be staring at a next disaster across the world. What happened with the League of Nations should not be repeated. So that is something, how you can frame the answer and expect good marks. Then analyze the setting up of fact-checking unit as per the amended IT rules. Discuss the need and the dangers posed. This is basically going to be relevant for your GS2. Again. So here again, you have to talk about that the new amended IT rules, they talk about setting up of the FCU. What will be the job of the FCU? If the intermediaries don't take down any post or content, then they won't be provided a kind of the security in terms of the liability that they hold. And then also, what is the need for it? Need in the sense that to stop the spread of the fake news, to ensure social harmony, etc., to ensure veracity of the facts which are propagated to the public. And the dangers, we have also talked about fair criticism, the very subjective nature of the term misleading, all those aspects you have to talk about. And eventually, while concluding there, you have to talk about the requirement for transparency and instilling safeguards in setting up of these FCUs so that constitutional mechanism is upheld at the end of the day. Okay, so that will be all for our discussion for today. If you have liked the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. Please do visit the Telegram channel to take up the quiz for the associated questions. We meet again tomorrow. Till that point of time, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.